Welcome to the quiet, persistent mystery of the men in black, where the most frightening possibility isn't that we're being visited by beings from other worlds, but that we're being managed by beings from this one. Here on this channel, I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. Let me set the stage for tonight's first encounter. It was a humid August evening in 1987 when electrical technician Mark Hammond finished his shift at the power substation just outside Meridian, Mississippi. Mark had worked the same route for 12 years, knew every transformer and power line in his sector. What he didn't expect was to witness something that would fundamentally alter his understanding of what moves through our skies at night. Mark was driving home along the old county road when his headlights caught something unusual in the distance. 3 perfectly round lights hung motionless above the tree line, arranged in a triangle formation. They weren't blinking like aircraft lights. They weren't moving like helicopters. They simply existed in the humid night air, casting a soft amber glow that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Mark pulled his truck to the shoulder and stepped out, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The lights maintained their formation for nearly 10 minutes before ascending vertically with impossible speed, vanishing into the star-filled sky without a sound. Mark stood in the quiet aftermath, cicadas resuming their chorus as if nothing had happened. He climbed back into his truck, drove home, and told his wife Sarah about the sighting over a late dinner. They discussed it briefly, wondered if it might have been some kind of military exercise, then went to bed, thinking the incident was behind them. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning, Mark was drinking coffee on his front porch when a black sedan pulled into his driveway. 2 men emerged, both wearing identical dark suits despite the August heat. They approached with measured steps, their faces professionally neutral. The older of the 2 men introduced himself simply as Mr. Davis, offered no first name, no agency affiliation, no badge or identification of any kind. Mr. Davis asked if they could speak privately about the lights Mark had observed on Monday evening. Mark felt his stomach drop. He hadn't reported the sighting to anyone official. The only person he told was Sarah, and she certainly hadn't contacted any government agencies. Yet here were 2 federal agents, or men who certainly looked like federal agents, asking about an incident that existed only in Mark's memory and his brief conversation with his wife. The second man remained silent throughout the encounter, standing slightly behind Mr. Davis, hands clasped behind his back, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses that seemed unnecessary in the shaded morning light. Mr. Davis spoke in measured tones about atmospheric disturbances and the importance of not allowing imagination to transform ordinary phenomena into something extraordinary. He suggested that power lines could create unusual optical effects, especially in humid conditions, and that what Mark believed he'd witnessed was likely nothing more than heat lightning or reflected light from distant aircraft. But Mr. Davis's explanation felt rehearsed, almost scripted, as if he'd delivered similar words to other witnesses in other driveways across the country. More unsettling was his detailed knowledge of Mark's route home that evening, his precise description of where Mark had stopped his truck, even his mention of the specific duration Mark had observed the lights. Information that should have been impossible for anyone to know unless they'd been watching from the shadows. The encounter lasted less than 15 minutes. Mr. Davis thanked Mark for his time, mentioned that atmospheric phenomena could sometimes be misinterpreted by well-meaning citizens, and suggested that sharing such misinterpretations might unnecessarily alarm neighbors and friends. No explicit threats were made. No demands for silence were issued. Yet Mark understood perfectly that his experience was being gently but firmly classified as something that had never really happened at all. After the men left, Mark found himself questioning details of his own memory. Had the lights really maintained such perfect formation? Had they truly ascended with impossible speed? The visitor's calm certainty about atmospheric disturbances began to seem more plausible than his own recollections. Within weeks, Mark had convinced himself that he'd probably witnessed some kind of natural phenomenon, nothing more mysterious than unusual weather conditions creating optical illusions in the humid Mississippi air. Years later, long after Mark had retired from the power company, he learned about other witnesses in his area who'd reported similar triangular formations of lights during that same time period. Each had received visits from polite men in dark suits. Each had been offered reasonable explanations for unreasonable sightings. Each had gradually accepted that their memories were probably faulty, their perceptions unreliable. The collective experience had been quietly and systematically normalized, filed away in the psychological category of things that couldn't have happened, because they don't happen. Mark's story illustrates the sophisticated psychological approach these mysterious visitors employ. Rather than suppressing evidence through intimidation, they reshape perception through suggestion. They don't deny that something was seen. They simply provide alternative explanations that allow witnesses to maintain their dignity while abandoning their extraordinary claims. It's a form of gaslighting so subtle that victims often participate willingly in their own psychological manipulation. But not every encounter follows this gentle pattern of suggestion and redirection. Sometimes the men in black reveal a more direct approach, as experienced by commercial pilot Janet Morrison during a routine flight from Denver to Phoenix in March of 1994. Janet had logged over 15,000 flight hours, earned commendations for her professionalism, and maintained a spotless safety record throughout her career. She was not prone to flights of imagination or misidentifying ordinary aircraft. The incident occurred at 37,000 feet, somewhere over the Four Corners region of the American Southwest. Janet was piloting a Boeing 737 with 123 passengers when air traffic control reported an unidentified radar contact approaching her flight path. Standard procedure required maintaining course, while controllers attempted to establish communication with the unknown aircraft. What Janet saw through her cockpit window defied every principle of aerodynamics she'd learned in 20 years of flying. The object paced her aircraft for nearly 8 minutes, maintaining perfect formation just off her starboard wing. It appeared solid, metallic, roughly disc-shaped, with no visible means of propulsion. No engine noise penetrated the cockpit despite the object's proximity. No heat signature appeared on the aircraft's thermal sensors, despite the obvious presence of a large metallic object in controlled airspace. Most disturbing of all, the object seemed to respond to Janet's subtle course corrections, adjusting its position to maintain exact formation as if operated by someone intimately familiar with commercial aviation procedures. Air traffic control confirmed the radar contact, but couldn't establish radio communication with the unknown aircraft. Janet's co-pilot witnessed the entire encounter, as did several passengers who happened to be looking out the starboard windows. The object eventually accelerated away at impossible speed, vanishing from both visual and radar contact in seconds. Janet filed the required report upon landing, documenting the incident according to federal aviation regulations and airline protocols. The visit came 36 hours later at Janet's apartment in Scottsdale. 2 men in dark suits knocked on her door at 7 in the evening, identifying themselves as investigators from the Federal Aviation Administration. They carried credentials that appeared authentic, spoke with authority about aviation safety, and demonstrated detailed knowledge of Janet's flight path, passenger manifest, and the precise timing of the radar contact. What they wanted was simple: a revised incident report describing the encounter as a case of mistaken identity involving a military aircraft conducting classified maneuvers in restricted airspace. Janet protested that no restricted airspace warnings had been issued, that the object's flight characteristics were impossible for any known military aircraft, and that her original report accurately described what she and multiple witnesses had observed. The men listened patiently, then explained that military exercises sometimes required temporary classification of airspace without advance notice to civilian pilots. They suggested that Janet's exemplary safety record and professional reputation could be jeopardized by reports of unidentified flying objects, particularly in an era when airline management was increasingly concerned about pilot reliability and psychological fitness. The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. Janet could maintain her career by filing an amended report describing a routine encounter with military aircraft, or she could persist with her extraordinary claims and face questions about her psychological stability. The choice was presented as purely professional, a matter of protecting her reputation and continuing her career in commercial aviation. No threats were made. No consequences were explicitly outlined. The men simply provided her with a pre-written amended report, thanked her for her cooperation, and left her alone to make what they characterized as a sensible decision. Janet spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the implications of signing a false report. Her professional integrity demanded honesty, but her economic reality required maintaining her pilot's license and her position with the airline. In the end, she filed the amended report, describing her encounter with what she now claimed was a military aircraft conducting classified maneuvers. The original report disappeared from official files. Her co-pilot was transferred to another route, and the passengers who'd witnessed the incident were never contacted for follow-up interviews. Years later, Janet learned that other commercial pilots had reported similar encounters during that same time period, followed by similar visits from men offering similar choices between career preservation and truthful reporting. The patterns suggested a coordinated effort to manage information flow within the aviation industry, ensuring that extraordinary encounters were systematically reclassified as ordinary misunderstandings or encounters with classified military aircraft. Janet's experience reveals another dimension of the men in Black phenomenon: their apparent integration into legitimate government and industry bureaucracies. These weren't mysterious strangers appearing from nowhere. They were individuals who seemed to operate within official channels while pursuing distinctly unofficial agendas. Their credentials appeared authentic, their knowledge of regulations and procedures was comprehensive, and their authority seemed genuine even when their requests clearly violated standard protocols. This bureaucratic camouflage makes the men in Black phenomenon particularly difficult to investigate or expose. Witnesses can't easily dismiss visitors who arrive with proper identification and demonstrate legitimate knowledge of official procedures. The encounters feel authentically governmental, even when their substance suggests something far more mysterious. It's as if someone has created a shadow bureaucracy that mirrors legitimate agencies while serving entirely different purposes. The psychological impact on witnesses like Janet extends far beyond the immediate encounter. They're forced to choose between professional survival and personal integrity, between maintaining their livelihoods and preserving their truthfulness. Most choose pragmatically, filing false reports and convincing themselves that their memories were probably unreliable anyway. The system works precisely because it offers witnesses rational reasons to participate in their own silencing. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these encounters isn't what the men in black do, but what their very existence implies about the nature of reality in modern America. If ordinary citizens can witness extraordinary events and then receive visits from mysterious officials who somehow know intimate details about private experiences, what does that suggest about the level of surveillance and control operating just beyond public awareness? These questions become even more troubling when we consider encounters like the one experienced by radio engineer David Chen in the mountains of Northern California during the summer of 1998. David was conducting routine maintenance on a remote communications tower when he witnessed something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between public and private experience in America. David was alone on the mountainside, 40 miles from the nearest town, working on equipment that few people even knew existed. The communications tower served as a relay point for emergency services across 3 counties, positioned on a ridge so remote that David had to hike the final 2 miles with his equipment, because the access road had been washed out by spring floods. It was the kind of solitude that most people never experience, the profound quiet that comes from being genuinely alone in wilderness. He was replacing a faulty transmitter component when the forest went silent. Not gradually, as sometimes happens before storms, but instantly, as if someone had thrown a switch. The wind stopped moving through the pines. Birds ceased their calls. Even the insects fell quiet. David looked up from his work, feeling the sudden stillness like a physical presence. That's when he saw it descending through the canopy. The object moved with impossible grace between the towering pines, never disturbing a single branch despite its size. It was roughly oval, perhaps 30 feet across, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No sound accompanied its movement, no disturbance of air or displacement of forest debris. It settled into a clearing about 50 yards from the tower, resting so lightly on the forest floor that it might have been weightless. David crouched behind the equipment housing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd brought a digital camera to document the maintenance work, and now he found himself raising it with trembling hands. Through the viewfinder, the object appeared even more impossible, its edges sharp against the filtered sunlight, its surface unmarked by any visible seams or openings. He pressed the shutter button, then again, capturing what he was certain would be the most important photographs of his life. The object remained motionless for perhaps 20 minutes. David continued photographing, switching between his camera and a small video recorder he kept for work documentation. Then, as silently as it had arrived, the craft began to rise. It ascended straight up through the canopy, somehow navigating between branches that should have blocked its path, until it disappeared into the afternoon sky. The forest sounds returned gradually, as if nature itself had been holding its breath. David completed his maintenance work in a daze, his mind cycling between rational skepticism and the undeniable evidence of his senses. He hiked back to his truck as the sun was setting, drove the winding mountain roads back to civilization, and spent the evening in his small apartment reviewing the photographs and video footage. The images were clear, undeniable, extraordinary. He had documented something that would change human understanding of what was possible. The next morning brought a knock at his door before David had finished his first cup of coffee. Two men stood in the hallway outside his apartment, both wearing dark suits that seemed oddly formal for the casual mountain town where David lived. They introduced themselves with names that sounded official but forgettable, claimed to represent a federal agency concerned with electromagnetic interference near sensitive communication facilities. They knew about the tower maintenance. They knew about David's work schedule. They knew he'd been alone on the mountain the previous day. Most disturbing of all, they knew about the photographs and video footage, describing the content with precision that suggested they'd already seen the images David was certain he'd shown to no one. The older of the two men explained that military aircraft sometimes conducted classified tests in remote areas, using experimental propulsion systems that could interfere with communication equipment. Such tests required strict secrecy to protect national security interests. Civilians who inadvertently witnessed these exercises were asked to surrender any documentation that might compromise operational security. David protested that what he'd seen bore no resemblance to any aircraft, experimental or otherwise. The visitors listened politely, then produced a tablet computer displaying satellite imagery of the exact clearing where David had witnessed the object. The timestamp showed the previous afternoon, the precise time of David's encounter. But the clearing was empty in the satellite image, showing only undisturbed forest canopy. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. David found himself staring at official imagery that contradicted his own documented experience. Either the satellite data was falsified, or his own senses and equipment had somehow deceived him. The men offered no explanation for the discrepancy, simply requested that David provide his camera and video recorder for analysis of potential electromagnetic interference. The choice was presented as routine technical cooperation, But David understood the implications. He could surrender his evidence and accept the official explanation of classified military testing, or he could insist on the accuracy of his documentation and face questions about his reliability as a contractor working on sensitive communication systems. His security clearance, his livelihood, his reputation in the small technical community, where everyone knew everyone else, all hung in the balance. David handed over his camera and video recorder. The men thanked him for his cooperation, mentioned that electromagnetic interference sometimes caused recording equipment to malfunction in unexpected ways, and suggested that memory could be surprisingly unreliable when exposed to certain types of electromagnetic fields. They left him with a business card bearing only a phone number and a recommendation that he avoid discussing his experience until the investigation was complete. The equipment was returned 3 days later by courier, accompanied by a brief report explaining that electromagnetic interference had caused significant distortion in both photographic and video recordings. The images David remembered so clearly were now corrupted beyond recognition, showing only blurred shapes that could have been shadows, reflections, or equipment malfunctions. The video footage was completely blank, as if nothing had been recorded at all. David examined the corrupted files with growing unease. The timestamps were correct, the file sizes suggested original recordings, but the content had been systematically destroyed or replaced. Either his equipment had experienced unprecedented simultaneous failure, or someone possessed technology capable of selectively editing digital media while preserving all other file characteristics. More troubling still, David began experiencing gaps in his own memory of the encounter. Details that had seemed crystal clear immediately after the sighting became fuzzy and uncertain. Had the object really been as large as he remembered? Had it truly moved with such impossible silence? The visitor's suggestions about electromagnetic effects on human perception began to seem more plausible than his increasingly uncertain recollections. Within weeks, David had convinced himself that he'd probably witnessed some kind of experimental aircraft, nothing more extraordinary than classified military technology being tested in remote areas where civilian interference would be minimal. The corrupted recordings became evidence of equipment malfunction rather than documentation of impossible encounters. His memory adapted to fit the official explanation, filling in gaps with reasonable assumptions about misperceived military exercises. David's experience illustrates the sophisticated technological capabilities that seem to support the Men in Black operations. These aren't simply psychological manipulation tactics. They involve the ability to alter digital evidence, manipulate satellite imagery, and possibly influence human memory itself. The implications suggest resources and capabilities far beyond what most government agencies publicly acknowledge possessing. The systematic nature of these evidence alterations raises profound questions about the relationship between official reality and actual experience in modern America. If digital documentation can be seamlessly corrupted, if satellite imagery can be manipulated in real time, if human memory can be influenced through unknown technological means, then the very foundations of evidence and proof become questionable. This technological dimension of the Men in Black phenomenon becomes even more apparent in encounters like the one experienced by marine biologist Dr. Sarah Hendricks during a research expedition off the coast of Northern California in September 2003. Dr. Hendricks was leading a team studying deep-sea bioluminescence, using advanced underwater cameras to document organisms in previously unexplored ocean depths. The research vessel Meridian was positioned over an underwater canyon system, deploying remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras and sophisticated recording equipment. The team had been working for 3 days, cataloging species and documenting behaviors at depths exceeding 2,000 feet. Their work was methodical, scientific, thoroughly documented according to academic research protocols. On the third evening, as the team was retrieving their equipment for the day, something extraordinary appeared on their monitor screens. Rising from the deepest part of the canyon came objects that defied every principle of marine biology Dr. Hendricks had learned in 15 years of oceanographic research. They moved with purpose and intelligence, maintaining perfect formation, emitting their own bioluminescent patterns that seemed to pulse with intentional communication. The objects were clearly artificial, displaying geometric precision impossible in natural organisms. They rose through the water column at speeds that should have created massive turbulence, yet the surrounding water remained perfectly calm. Most remarkably, they seemed to be aware of the research team's presence, adjusting their formation and behavior in response to the underwater cameras. Dr. Hendricks and her team documented everything, their excitement building as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The objects remained visible for nearly 2 hours, performing maneuvers that challenged basic understanding of underwater physics. Multiple cameras captured the encounter from different angles, while sophisticated sonar and electromagnetic sensors recorded data that would revolutionize marine science. The objects eventually descended back into the canyon depths, leaving the research team in stunned silence. Dr. Hendricks immediately began preparing preliminary reports, knowing that their documentation would require careful presentation to the scientific community. The implications were staggering, potentially rewriting textbooks and opening entirely new fields of research. The visit came before they reached port. A Coast Guard cutter intercepted the Meridian while still in international waters, requesting permission to board for what was described as a routine inspection of research permits and equipment. Dr. Hendricks had no legal grounds to refuse, despite the unusual timing and location of the inspection. The boarding party included 2 men who clearly weren't Coast Guard personnel. They wore civilian clothes beneath their safety equipment, carried credentials from agencies Dr. Hendricks didn't recognize, and demonstrated detailed knowledge of the research team's activities. They requested access to all recording equipment, claiming to investigate reports of unauthorized sonar testing that might interfere with submarine operations. Dr. Hendricks protested that her team's equipment operated within legal parameters and had been properly registered with maritime authorities. The visitors acknowledged her compliance with regulations, but explained that national security concerns sometimes required temporary seizure of equipment that might have inadvertently recorded classified underwater activities. The choice was presented as cooperation with legitimate security investigations. Dr. Hendricks could voluntarily surrender her equipment for analysis, or face formal seizure under national security statutes that would likely result in permanent confiscation and possible criminal charges for her entire research team. The implications for her career, her students, and her institution's federal funding were made clear without being explicitly stated. Dr. Hendricks watched helplessly as her team's equipment was loaded onto the Coast Guard vessel. Months of research data, irreplaceable documentation of deep-sea ecosystems, and the extraordinary evidence of their recent encounter disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of national security classification. The visitors assured her that equipment would be returned once analysis was complete, but provided no timeline or contact information for follow-up inquiries. The equipment was never returned. Official inquiries were met with responses stating that no record existed of any seizure, that Dr. Hendricks must be mistaken about the circumstances of her equipment loss. The Coast Guard denied any involvement in boarding her vessel, despite detailed logs and witness testimony from her entire research team. The encounter had been systematically erased from official records, leaving Dr. Hendricks with no recourse and no evidence. More disturbing still, Dr. Hendricks began experiencing memory difficulties regarding the specifics of what her team had witnessed. Details that had seemed crystal clear immediately after the encounter became vague and uncertain. Her research notes, usually meticulous, contained gaps and inconsistencies she couldn't explain. Other team members reported similar memory problems, as if their shared experience was slowly fading from collective recollection. Within a year, Dr. Hendricks had convinced herself that they'd probably witnessed some kind of military underwater testing. Nothing more extraordinary than classified submarine technology being evaluated in deep ocean environments. The seized equipment became evidence of her team's inadvertent interference with national security operations rather than documentation of impossible underwater encounters. Dr. Hendrix's experience reveals the global reach of the Men in Black phenomenon, extending far beyond American airspace into international waters and academic research institutions. The ability to intercept research vessels, manipulate official records, and influence the memory of multiple trained observers suggests capabilities and coordination that transcend individual government agencies or departments. The systematic suppression of scientific evidence raises particularly troubling questions about the boundaries between national security and academic freedom. If research teams can have their work confiscated and their memories altered, if evidence can be seized and official records can be manipulated, then the very foundations of scientific inquiry become subject to invisible oversight and control. These encounters paint a picture of a world where extraordinary experiences are systematically normalized through sophisticated psychological and technological manipulation. Witnesses find themselves caught between their own memories and official explanations, between documented evidence and bureaucratic denials, between personal integrity and professional survival. Most choose the path of least resistance, accepting official explanations and allowing their extraordinary experiences to fade into the comfortable realm of misunderstanding and misperception. The Men in Black operate in this grey area between experience and explanation, between memory and record, between what people witness and what they're allowed to believe they witnessed. They represent a form of reality management so subtle and sophisticated that victims often participate willingly in their own psychological manipulation, convinced that accepting official explanations is simply the rational response to confusing experiences. As we continue our journey through these encounters, remember that each story represents not just an individual experience, but a window into the mechanisms by which extraordinary events are transformed into ordinary explanations. The witnesses you're hearing about tonight didn't seek out these encounters. They simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps the right place at the right time, depending on your perspective on the nature of truth in modern America. The pattern of psychological manipulation becomes even more sophisticated when we examine the encounter experienced by freelance journalist Michael Torres in the high desert of Nevada during October 2005. Michael had spent 2 decades investigating stories that mainstream media wouldn't touch, developing sources within military and intelligence communities who trusted his discretion and respected his commitment to accuracy. He understood the difference between legitimate classified information and deliberate misinformation, between protecting national security and protecting institutional embarrassment. Michael was researching a story about unexplained aircraft activity near restricted airspace when he received a tip from a contact at Nellis Air Force Base. The source, a radar technician with impeccable credentials, claimed that something extraordinary had been tracked, moving through controlled airspace at impossible speeds. Multiple radar installations had recorded the same anomalous signatures, creating a paper trail that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. The meeting was arranged for a remote location in the desert, far from electronic surveillance and curious observers. Michael drove out on a moonless night, navigating by GPS to coordinates provided by his source. The isolation was complete, nothing but sand and scrub brush stretching to the horizon in every direction. It was the kind of emptiness that makes you acutely aware of your own vulnerability, your dependence on technology and civilization that suddenly seems very far away. His contact arrived precisely on time, nervous but determined to share information he believed the public deserved to know. The radar data was compelling, showing objects that accelerated from stationary to several thousand miles per hour in seconds, performed 90-degree turns at velocities that should have destroyed any known aircraft, and disappeared from tracking systems without explanation. The timestamps were verified, the signatures were consistent across multiple installations, and the implications were staggering. Michael spent 3 hours reviewing documents, taking photographs, and conducting a recorded interview with his source. The evidence was undeniable, the kind of documentation that could force official acknowledgement of phenomena that had been dismissed and denied for decades. He thanked his contact, promised to protect his identity, and began the long drive back to Las Vegas with a story that could change everything. The interference began before he reached the highway. Michael's cell phone started displaying error messages, losing signal despite being in an area where coverage had been strong during his drive out. His GPS system flickered and reset repeatedly, showing his location as coordinates that didn't correspond to any recognizable landmarks. Most disturbing of all, his digital camera began displaying corrupted file warnings for the photographs he'd just taken. By the time Michael reached his hotel room, every piece of digital evidence from the encounter had been systematically destroyed. Photographs showed only static and distortion. Audio recordings contained nothing but electronic noise. Even his handwritten notes seemed somehow different, as if the ink had faded or his own handwriting had become illegible. The memory card from his camera was completely blank, despite showing the correct file count and timestamps. Michael sat in his hotel room, staring at the ruined evidence of what should have been the story of his career. He'd witnessed the systematic destruction of documentation in real time, watched as his equipment failed in ways that seemed coordinated rather than coincidental. Someone possessed the capability to remotely corrupt digital media, interfere with electronic systems, and possibly manipulate physical documents as well. The knock came at dawn, so soft Michael almost missed it over the sound of the air conditioning unit. Two men stood in the hallway, both wearing dark suits despite the desert heat that was already building. They looked tired, as if they'd been traveling all night, but their eyes were alert and focused. The older man introduced himself as Agent Richardson, though he offered no agency affiliation or identification beyond a business card that contained only a name and phone number. Agent Richardson asked if they could discuss Michael's research into aerospace phenomena, mentioning specific details about his investigation that should have been known only to Michael and his editor. They knew about his sources, his methods, even his travel itinerary. More unsettling still, they seemed to know about the failed meeting in the desert, describing the encounter with precision that suggested they'd been monitoring the situation from the beginning. The conversation that followed was unlike any government interview Michael had experienced in 20 years of investigative reporting. There were no explicit threats, no demands for information, no attempts to identify his sources. Instead, the visitors seemed more interested in understanding Michael's motivations, his commitment to the story, his willingness to continue pursuing information that might not be in the public interest. Agent Richardson explained that certain aerospace technologies required protection from foreign intelligence services, that premature disclosure could compromise national security advantages that had taken decades to develop. He suggested that responsible journalists understood the difference between legitimate public interest and sensationalism that could endanger American technological superiority. The psychological pressure was subtle but relentless. The visitors never demanded that Michael abandon his investigation, but they made it clear that continuing would bring him into conflict with interests far more powerful than his newspaper or his sources. They mentioned the difficulties that investigative journalists sometimes faced when their work conflicted with national security priorities, the way careers could be derailed by questions about reliability and judgment. Michael found himself in an impossible position. His professional integrity demanded pursuing the story, but his rational mind recognized the futility of fighting an adversary with unlimited resources and no accountability. The visitors hadn't threatened him directly, but they demonstrated capabilities that made explicit threats unnecessary. They could destroy evidence, manipulate records, and apparently monitor private communications with ease. The meeting ended with Agent Richardson leaving a manila folder on Michael's desk. Inside were photocopies of classified documents related to experimental aircraft testing, materials that appeared to explain the radar anomalies his source had described. The aircraft were indeed extraordinary, representing technological advances beyond public knowledge. But they were terrestrial in origin, developed by American aerospace contractors working under the deepest levels of classification. The documents provided a rational explanation for everything Michael had investigated. The impossible flight characteristics were actually possible, just highly classified. The radar signatures weren't evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, but proof of American technological superiority. The secrecy wasn't a conspiracy to hide alien contact, but necessary protection of strategic military advantages. Michael studied the documents for hours, cross-referencing technical specifications with the radar data his source had provided. The explanations were plausible, even elegant, offering rational answers to questions that had seemed to point toward extraordinary conclusions. By accepting the classified aircraft explanation, Michael could maintain his reputation as a serious journalist, while avoiding confrontation with powers that had demonstrated their ability to destroy his evidence and possibly his career. But something about the encounter nagged at Michael's investigative instincts. The visitors had arrived too quickly, known too much, possessed capabilities that seemed to exceed what any government agency should have. Their psychological approach had been too sophisticated, their knowledge too comprehensive, their resources too unlimited. They'd presented him with exactly the kind of alternative explanation that would allow him to abandon his investigation while preserving his professional dignity. Michael never published the story. The classified documents provided him with a face-saving explanation for dropping his investigation, allowing him to tell his editor that the phenomena had been satisfactorily explained through legitimate government sources. His source at Nellis Air Force Base was transferred to another installation within days, ending their communication. The radar data disappeared from military files, reclassified at levels that placed it beyond Michael's access. Years later, Michael learned that other journalists had investigated similar phenomena during the same time period, receiving visits from the same mysterious agents offering the same classified explanations. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to manage information flow within the media, ensuring that extraordinary stories were systematically transformed into ordinary explanations through a combination of evidence destruction and alternative narrative provision. Michael's experience reveals the media management dimension of the Men in Black phenomenon, their apparent ability to identify and neutralize journalistic investigations before they reach public attention. These weren't random encounters with individual witnesses. They represented systematic intervention in the information ecosystem, ensuring that certain stories never reached the audiences they might otherwise find. The implications extend far beyond individual cases of witness intimidation. If journalists can be monitored, their sources can be identified, and their evidence can be destroyed, then the very foundations of investigative reporting become subject to invisible oversight and control. The Fourth Estate, theoretically independent and adversarial, becomes just another system to be managed by authorities operating beyond public accountability. This media manipulation becomes even more apparent in the encounter experienced by documentary filmmaker Lisa Chang while investigating unexplained phenomena in the Pacific Northwest during the summer of 2008. Lisa had built her reputation on careful, methodical documentation of subjects that mainstream media typically dismissed or sensationalized. Her approach combined scientific rigor with compelling storytelling, creating films that educated audiences while entertaining them. Lisa was deep into production on a documentary about unexplained sightings in the Cascade Mountains when she received permission to interview a former Forest Service ranger who claimed to have witnessed extraordinary events during his decades of service. The ranger, Thomas McKenna, had agreed to speak on camera about encounters that had troubled him for years, experiences he'd been unable to report through official channels without risking his career and reputation. The interview took place at McKenna's remote cabin, surrounded by the same forests where he'd served for 30 years. His account was detailed, consistent, and compelling, describing multiple encounters with objects and entities that challenged conventional understanding of what inhabited the deep wilderness. McKenna provided maps, photographs, and documentation that supported his extraordinary claims, creating exactly the kind of credible witness testimony that Lisa's documentaries required. Lisa spent 2 days filming with McKenna, capturing hours of interview footage and documenting the locations where his encounters had occurred. The material was extraordinary, potentially revolutionary, the kind of evidence that could shift public perception of phenomena typically dismissed as folklore or delusion. She thanked McKenna for his courage in speaking publicly, promised to present his story with the respect and accuracy it deserved, and began the long drive back to Seattle with footage that could define her career. The technical problems began during the drive home. Lisa's camera equipment started displaying error messages, warning of corrupted files, and storage media failures. By the time she reached her studio, every hour of interview footage had been systematically destroyed, leaving only fragments of unusable material. The audio recordings were filled with electronic interference, McKenna's voice buried beneath layers of static and distortion that made his words incomprehensible. Lisa spent days attempting to recover the lost footage, employing every data recovery technique she knew and consulting with professional technicians who specialized in retrieving corrupted media. The files appeared to exist but couldn't be accessed, as if they'd been locked behind encryption that no available software could break. The timestamps were correct, the file sizes suggested complete recordings, but the content remained forever beyond reach. The visit came while Lisa was still struggling with the technical failures. 2 men arrived at her studio, both wearing the kind of conservative business attire that seemed oddly formal for Seattle's casual professional environment. They introduced themselves as representatives of a federal agency concerned with unauthorized filming on public lands, claiming that Lisa's work had inadvertently violated regulations protecting sensitive ecological areas. The visitors knew intimate details about Lisa's project, describing her interview with McKenna with precision that suggested they'd somehow observed the encounter. They knew about the technical failures she'd experienced, mentioning specific error codes and file corruption patterns that should have been known only to Lisa and her technicians. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to know the content of the lost footage, referencing McKenna's claims and the evidence he'd provided. The explanation they offered was bureaucratic but plausible. McKenna's cabin was located near sensitive research areas where government scientists studied endangered species and fragile ecosystems. Unauthorized filming in these areas could compromise ongoing research, disturb wildlife, and potentially expose locations that required protection from public access. Lisa's documentary, however well-intentioned, had inadvertently interfered with legitimate scientific work. The visitors requested that Lisa abandon her documentary project, explaining that the subject matter could encourage other filmmakers and curiosity seekers to disturb protected areas. They offered her access to alternative story subjects, suggesting that her talents would be better applied to less controversial topics that didn't risk environmental damage or interference with scientific research. The psychological pressure was expertly applied. Lisa found herself positioned as someone whose work might inadvertently harm the very wilderness she sought to celebrate and protect. The visitors never questioned her motives or abilities, instead, appealing to her environmental consciousness and her desire to create responsible documentaries that educated rather than exploited. Lisa spent weeks wrestling with the decision, torn between her commitment to McKenna's story and her recognition that continuing the project would bring her into conflict with authorities who demonstrated their ability to destroy her work and possibly her career. The lost footage became symbolic of the futility of fighting an adversary with unlimited technological resources and no accountability. In the end, Lisa abandoned the documentary project, convincing herself that McKenna's story might have been less credible than she'd initially believed. The technical failures became evidence of equipment malfunction rather than systematic sabotage. The visitors' environmental concerns provided a rational justification for dropping a project that might have caused ecological damage. McKenna was relocated to a government nursing facility within months of Lisa's visit, diagnosed with early-stage dementia that explained his extraordinary claims as symptoms of cognitive decline. His documentation disappeared, his cabin was sold, and his story was effectively erased from the record. Lisa never spoke with him again, though she sometimes wondered if his mental deterioration was as natural as medical records suggested. Lisa's experience illustrates the environmental angle often employed in Men in Black operations, the way legitimate conservation concerns can be weaponized to suppress inconvenient stories. The visitors didn't need to deny that extraordinary events had occurred. They simply reframed them as potential threats to sensitive ecosystems that required protection from public attention. This environmental manipulation represents a particularly sophisticated form of psychological pressure, appealing to witnesses' better instincts while achieving the same suppression of information. It's much more difficult to resist authorities who position themselves as protectors of wilderness rather than suppressors of truth, who frame their requests as environmental responsibility rather than censorship. The pattern continues with increasing sophistication as we examine more recent encounters, suggesting that the Men in Black phenomenon has evolved and adapted to changing technological and social environments. The basic psychological principles remain constant, but the methods have become more subtle, more targeted, and more effective at achieving long-term suppression of extraordinary experiences. These encounters reveal a system of reality management so comprehensive and sophisticated that it operates like an immune response within society itself, identifying and neutralizing information that threatens established paradigms. Witnesses find themselves caught in webs of plausible explanations, reasonable alternatives, and rational justifications that make resistance seem not just futile, but irrational. The Men in Black don't need to threaten or intimidate because they've created a system where cooperation appears to be the only sensible choice. They offer witnesses ways to maintain their dignity while abandoning their extraordinary claims, provide alternative explanations that allow people to preserve their reputation while surrendering their truth, and create psychological pressure so subtle that victims often convince themselves that compliance was their own idea. As we drift deeper into these accounts, notice how the encounters share common elements that transcend individual experiences. The impossible knowledge of private details, the systematic destruction of evidence, the provision of alternative explanations, the psychological pressure applied with surgical precision, the way extraordinary experiences are transformed into ordinary misunderstandings through a combination of technology and psychology so advanced that it seems almost supernatural in its effectiveness. These aren't isolated incidents, but glimpses of a broader phenomenon that suggests our reality is far more carefully managed than most people realize. The Men in Black represent the visible edge of systems operating in the shadows of our society, ensuring that certain truths remain hidden and certain questions remain unasked. They are the guardians of consensus reality, the quiet enforcers of limitations on human perception and understanding. Tonight, as you listen to these stories, consider the possibility that the most profound mysteries aren't found in distant galaxies, but in the quiet spaces between what we experience and what we're allowed to believe we've experienced. The Men in Black remind us that in our modern world, the greatest form of control isn't physical force, but psychological manipulation. The ability to make people doubt their own perceptions and accept alternative explanations for experiences that challenge the boundaries of the possible. The accounts become even more disturbing when we consider how the phenomenon has adapted to our digital age, as experienced by software engineer Amanda Walsh during a camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains in July 2011. Amanda had driven up from Albany for a weekend of solitude, seeking the kind of complete disconnection from technology that only the deep wilderness can provide. She'd chosen a remote campsite accessible only by a narrow hiking trail, the kind of place where cell towers couldn't reach. and the only sounds were wind through pines and the distant call of loons across hidden lakes. Amanda was an experienced camper who understood the importance of preparation and safety protocols. She'd left detailed itineraries with friends, carried emergency communication devices, and packed enough supplies for extended stays in case weather made early departure impossible. What she hadn't prepared for was becoming witness to something that would challenge her understanding of both technology and reality itself. On her second night, Amanda was awakened by a sound unlike anything she'd ever heard in the wilderness. It wasn't the crash of falling trees or the call of nocturnal animals, but a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. She emerged from her tent to find the forest bathed in an eerie blue-white glow that had no visible source, as if the air itself was luminescent. Above the tree line, 3 objects moved in perfect synchronization, each roughly the size of a small aircraft, but displaying flight characteristics that defied every principle of aerodynamics Amanda knew from her work with aviation software systems. They moved with fluid grace, stopping and starting without deceleration, changing direction with impossible precision. Most remarkably, they seemed to respond to her observation, adjusting their formation when she moved, altering their altitude when she raised her camera. Amanda documented everything with her digital camera and smartphone, shooting both photographs and video of the extraordinary display. The objects remained visible for nearly an hour, performing maneuvers that no earthly technology could accomplish, before ascending vertically and disappearing into the star-filled sky. The forest sounds gradually returned as the luminescence faded, leaving Amanda alone with the most compelling evidence of unexplained phenomena she could imagine. Back in Albany, Amanda spent days analyzing her footage, enhancing images, and cross-referencing her observations with known aircraft capabilities. The evidence was undeniable, the kind of documentation that could force scientific acknowledgement of phenomena that had been dismissed for decades. She began preparing a comprehensive report, intending to submit her findings to both civilian and military aviation authorities. The cyber attack began subtly, with minor glitches in her computer systems that Amanda initially attributed to routine software conflicts. Email messages failed to send, files became temporarily inaccessible, and her internet connection experienced intermittent disruptions. But the problems escalated quickly, with sophisticated malware infiltrating her systems, despite military-grade security software she'd installed as part of her professional work. Within 48 hours, every piece of digital evidence from her camping trip had been systematically corrupted or deleted. Photographs showed only distorted pixels, video files contained nothing but electronic snow, and even her backup drives had been remotely wiped clean. The attack was so comprehensive and sophisticated that it seemed to target specific files while leaving the rest of her digital life completely untouched. Amanda recognized the signs of advanced persistent threat malware, the kind of cyber warfare tools typically associated with nation-state actors or intelligence agencies. Someone with extraordinary technical capabilities had identified and eliminated her evidence with surgical precision, demonstrating resources and expertise that exceeded what most government agencies publicly acknowledged possessing. The visit came while Amanda was still struggling to understand how her security systems had been compromised so completely. A woman appeared at her apartment door, professionally dressed in a way that suggested government employment without clearly identifying any specific agency. She introduced herself simply as Miss Chen, offered credentials that appeared authentic, but bore no familiar logos or departmental identifications. Ms. Chen asked if they could discuss Amanda's recent experiences with electromagnetic interference during her camping trip, demonstrating knowledge of her activities that should have been impossible for anyone to possess. She knew about the campsite location, the duration of Amanda's stay, even the specific equipment Amanda had used to document her observations. Most unsettling of all, she seemed to know about the cyber attack, referencing the malware infiltration with casual familiarity. The explanation Ms. Chen provided was technical and plausible. Military contractors were testing experimental electromagnetic pulse devices in remote areas, creating interference patterns that could affect both electronic equipment and human perception. Civilians who inadvertently witnessed these tests sometimes experienced visual distortions and equipment malfunctions that could be misinterpreted as extraordinary phenomena. The cybersecurity breach was explained as a necessary protective measure to prevent classified electromagnetic signatures from being accidentally disclosed through civilian documentation. Amanda's systems had been targeted not maliciously, but as part of routine security protocols designed to protect sensitive military research from foreign intelligence services who might exploit inadvertent civilian observations. Ms. Chen provided Amanda with technical documentation explaining the electromagnetic effects she'd witnessed, complete with scientific papers and classified research summaries that offered rational explanations for everything Amanda had observed. The objects she'd seen were actually plasma formations created by experimental energy weapons. Their impossible flight characteristics explained by electromagnetic field manipulation rather than conventional propulsion. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Amanda found herself confronted with official explanations that transformed her extraordinary experience into a case study of electromagnetic interference and human perceptual error. The sophisticated cyber attack became evidence of legitimate security protocols rather than evidence suppression. The documentation destruction justified as protection of national secrets rather than silencing of inconvenient witnesses. Amanda accepted Ms. Chen's explanations, partly from professional respect for the technical sophistication demonstrated, partly from recognition that resistance would be futile against adversaries with such advanced capabilities. She signed non-disclosure agreements related to the electromagnetic testing, agreed to avoid discussing her experiences until declassification reviews were complete, and convinced herself that she'd probably witnessed classified military research rather than impossible phenomena. The encounter left Amanda with a profound sense of unease about the boundaries between civilian privacy and national security surveillance. The ease with which her systems had been penetrated, her evidence destroyed, and her experience reframed suggested levels of monitoring and control that exceeded what most Americans realized existed. If software engineers with advanced security knowledge could be so easily targeted and manipulated, what did that suggest about the vulnerability of ordinary citizens? Amanda's experience reveals the technological evolution of the Men in Black phenomenon, their adaptation to digital environments and cyber warfare capabilities. These aren't just psychological operations anymore. They're comprehensive information warfare campaigns that can target individuals with precision while maintaining plausible deniability through legitimate security protocols. The cyber dimension adds new layers of plausibility to the Men in Black operations, allowing evidence destruction to be explained as security measures rather than censorship, surveillance to be justified as counterintelligence rather than harassment, and manipulation to be framed as protection rather than suppression. Witnesses find themselves caught between their own experiences and technical explanations that make resistance seem not just futile, but potentially treasonous. This technological sophistication becomes even more apparent when we examine the encounter experienced by meteorologist Dr. James Sullivan while conducting atmospheric research in the mountains of Colorado during September 2014. Dr. Sullivan was leading a team studying unusual weather patterns that had been affecting the region, using advanced monitoring equipment to track atmospheric disturbances that seemed to defy conventional meteorological models. The research station was located at 11,000 feet elevation, positioned to monitor air currents and electromagnetic phenomena that couldn't be observed from lower altitudes. Dr. Sullivan's team had been documenting anomalous readings for several weeks, detecting energy signatures that didn't correspond to any known atmospheric or geological sources. The data suggested something was actively manipulating local weather patterns in ways that challenged fundamental understanding of meteorological science. On the night of September 23rd, the monitoring equipment detected massive electromagnetic disturbances, unlike anything in Dr. Sullivan's 30 years of atmospheric research. The energy readings were off the scale, suggesting the presence of technology capable of manipulating weather systems with precision that exceeded any known capabilities. Most remarkably, the disturbances seemed to be creating localized weather phenomena, generating clouds and precipitation patterns that followed geometric rather than natural formations. Dr. Sullivan and his team observed the phenomena directly, watching as perfectly circular cloud formations appeared and dissipated in patterns that suggested intelligent control. Lightning struck in precise sequences that spelled out geometric patterns across the sky, while wind currents shifted direction with mathematical precision that natural systems couldn't achieve. The team documented everything, their excitement building as they realized they were witnessing evidence of weather manipulation technology. The technological interference began before dawn, with the research station's communication systems experiencing systematic failures that seemed coordinated rather than coincidental. Satellite uplinks were disrupted, radio communications filled with electronic interference, and internet connections became unreliable despite clear weather conditions that should have supported normal operations. By morning, every piece of monitoring equipment had experienced simultaneous failure, with data storage systems corrupted beyond recovery. Atmospheric sensors showed normal readings despite having recorded extraordinary phenomena just hours earlier. The comprehensive equipment failure was so coordinated that it seemed impossible without deliberate sabotage, yet no signs of physical tampering were visible. The visitors arrived with the sunrise, a helicopter landing at the research station without advance warning or clearance through normal aviation channels. 3 individuals emerged, 2 men and 1 woman, all wearing civilian clothes that suggested government employment without identifying specific agencies. They carried credentials that appeared authentic, but bore classifications Dr. Sullivan didn't recognize. The lead investigator introduced himself as Dr. Reynolds, claiming to represent an interagency task force studying electromagnetic interference with atmospheric research equipment. He demonstrated detailed knowledge of Dr. Sullivan's work, referencing specific data points and research methodologies that should have been known only to the immediate research team. Dr. Reynolds explained that military contractors were testing advanced weather modification technologies in the region, creating electromagnetic effects that could interfere with civilian monitoring equipment. The phenomena Dr. Sullivan's team had observed were actually controlled experiments in atmospheric manipulation, classified research that required protection from foreign intelligence services who might exploit meteorological data for strategic advantages. The equipment failures were explained as necessary security measures to prevent classified electromagnetic signatures from being inadvertently recorded by civilian researchers. Dr. Sullivan's monitoring systems had been remotely disabled not maliciously, but as part of routine protocols designed to protect sensitive military research from accidental disclosure through academic channels. The visitors provided Dr. Sullivan with replacement equipment and technical documentation explaining the electromagnetic interference his team had experienced. The new monitoring systems were more advanced than his original equipment, representing significant upgrades that would enhance his research capabilities. However, the devices included remote monitoring capabilities that would allow government agencies to observe and potentially control data collection in real time. Dr. Sullivan found himself in an impossible position, torn between scientific integrity and practical necessity. The equipment failures had destroyed months of research data, potentially ruining projects that had taken years to develop. The replacement systems offered advanced capabilities that could revolutionize his work, but accepting them meant submitting to surveillance and potential manipulation by agencies operating beyond academic oversight. The psychological pressure was expertly applied, appealing to Dr. Sullivan's professional ambitions while making resistance seem both futile and counterproductive. The visitors never threatened his career directly, but they made it clear that uncooperative researchers might find their funding applications less favorably reviewed. their access to restricted research areas curtailed, and their professional reputations subjected to questions about reliability and security consciousness. Dr. Sullivan accepted the replacement equipment and signed agreements acknowledging his understanding of electromagnetic interference protocols. He convinced himself that the weather phenomena his team had observed were probably classified military experiments, nothing more extraordinary than advanced atmospheric manipulation technologies being tested under strict security protocols. The incident was officially recorded as equipment failure due to electromagnetic interference, with no mention of the extraordinary phenomena that had preceded the technical problems. Dr. Sullivan's research continued using the new monitoring systems, but he never again detected the kind of anomalous readings that had characterized his work before the visit. Whether this represented actual changes in atmospheric conditions or remote control of his monitoring capabilities remained unclear. Dr. Sullivan's experience illustrates the academic infiltration dimension of the Men in Black phenomenon, their apparent ability to monitor and manipulate scientific research through technological means. These aren't random encounters with individual witnesses. They represent systematic intervention in the scientific process itself, ensuring that certain discoveries remain classified and certain research directions are subtly discouraged. The provision of replacement equipment creates a particularly insidious form of control, offering researchers enhanced capabilities while subjecting them to surveillance and potential manipulation. Scientists find themselves dependent on systems that may be compromised, conducting research that may be monitored, publishing results that may be selectively edited or suppressed. This scientific manipulation extends beyond individual researchers to entire fields of study, as illustrated by the encounter experienced by archaeologist Dr. Maria Santos while excavating a pre-Columbian site in the Arizona desert during March 2016. Dr. Santos was leading an international team investigating evidence of advanced ancient civilizations, using ground-penetrating radar and other technologies to map buried structures that challenged conventional understanding of North American prehistory. The excavation had revealed artifacts and architectural features that suggested technological capabilities far beyond what mainstream archaeology attributed to ancient peoples. The structures showed evidence of advanced engineering, precise astronomical alignments, and construction techniques that seemed impossible without sophisticated tools and mathematical knowledge. Most intriguingly, the team had discovered what appeared to be landing platforms, circular stone formations with electromagnetic properties that suggested they might have been designed to interact with aerial vehicles. The platforms were positioned according to celestial alignments that demonstrated advanced astronomical knowledge, while ground-penetrating radar revealed additional structures extending deep underground. Dr. Santos was preparing preliminary reports that would revolutionize understanding of ancient American civilizations when the site was suddenly declared off-limits due to newly discovered endangered species habitat requirements. Federal wildlife officials arrived with court orders mandating immediate cessation of archaeological work to protect supposedly critical ecosystems that previous surveys had failed to identify. The timing was suspicious, coming just as the team was preparing to announce discoveries that would challenge fundamental assumptions about ancient technological capabilities. The wildlife habitat designation seemed designed specifically to prevent further excavation rather than protect genuinely endangered species, especially since comprehensive biological surveys had been conducted before the archaeological work began. Dr. Santos protested the site closure through proper academic and legal channels, but found herself confronted by bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to prevent effective appeal. Environmental lawyers working for the research institution advised accepting the closure rather than engaging in costly legal battles against federal agencies with unlimited resources and political support. The visitors came while Dr. Santos was preparing alternative research proposals, hoping to continue her work at nearby sites that might contain similar artifacts. Two individuals appeared at her hotel, both carrying credentials from agencies she didn't recognize, claiming to represent an interagency task force concerned with protecting Native American cultural resources from inappropriate academic exploitation. The psychological approach was particularly sophisticated, appealing to Dr. Santos's respect for indigenous cultures while reframing her research as potentially harmful to tribal interests. The visitors suggested that her discoveries might be misinterpreted by sensationalist media, creating public interest that could lead to looting and vandalism of sacred sites. They provided her with alternative research opportunities, offering funding for projects that would focus on conventional archaeological subjects rather than potentially controversial discoveries that might attract unwanted attention. The funding levels were substantial, representing career opportunities that few academics could afford to refuse, especially when presented as socially responsible alternatives to research that might inadvertently harm indigenous communities. Dr. Santos found herself positioned as someone whose work might accidentally contribute to cultural exploitation, despite her genuine commitment to responsible archaeology and her collaborative relationships with local tribal authorities. The visitors never questioned her professional competence or ethical standards, instead, appealing to her desire to conduct research that respected rather than exploited indigenous heritage. The pressure was subtle but relentless, making resistance seem not just professionally risky, but morally questionable. Dr. Santos gradually convinced herself that her discoveries might indeed be better left undisturbed, that protecting indigenous cultural resources was more important than advancing archaeological knowledge, and that accepting alternative research funding was the responsible decision. The excavation site was permanently closed, officially designated as critical habitat for species that subsequent biological surveys failed to document. Dr. Santos's preliminary reports were classified as sensitive cultural information requiring protection under federal heritage preservation statutes. The artifacts and evidence that might have revolutionized understanding of ancient American civilizations disappeared into storage facilities that operated beyond academic access. Dr. Santos continued her career using the alternative funding, conducting research on conventional archaeological subjects that avoided controversial discoveries. She published papers on traditional topics, received professional recognition for her culturally sensitive approach to indigenous heritage, and gradually forgot about the extraordinary discoveries that had been deemed too sensitive for public disclosure. Her experience reveals the cultural sensitivity angle often employed in Men in Black operations. The way legitimate concerns about indigenous rights and cultural protection can be weaponized to suppress inconvenient archaeological discoveries. The visitors didn't need to deny that extraordinary artifacts had been found. They simply reframed the discoveries as potential threats to Native American communities that required protection through silence. This cultural manipulation represents another sophisticated form of psychological pressure, appealing to researchers' ethical instincts while achieving the same suppression of information that might challenge established historical narratives. It's particularly effective because it positions compliance as moral responsibility rather than censorship, making resistance seem not just futile but ethically questionable. The pattern continues with increasing refinement as we examine the most recent encounters, suggesting that the Men in Black phenomenon has evolved into a comprehensive system of reality management that operates across multiple disciplines and social sectors. The basic psychological principles remain constant, but the methods have become so sophisticated that they're virtually indistinguishable from legitimate institutional processes. Though, these encounters reveal how extraordinary experiences are systematically neutralized through a combination of technological capability, bureaucratic authority, and psychological manipulation so advanced that victims rarely recognize they're being controlled. The Men in Black don't operate outside the system. They've become the system itself, a shadow bureaucracy that mirrors legitimate institutions while serving entirely different purposes. As we continue our journey through these accounts, notice how each story builds upon previous patterns while introducing new dimensions of control and manipulation. The witnesses aren't random individuals. They're people whose professional positions or personal circumstances brought them into contact with phenomena that someone desperately wants to keep hidden. Their encounters suggest that we live in a world where extraordinary experiences are routinely transformed into ordinary explanations through processes so subtle and sophisticated that most people never realize they've been manipulated. The men in black represent the human face of systems operating far beyond public awareness, ensuring that certain truths remain hidden and certain questions remain unasked. They are the quiet guardians of consensus reality, the invisible enforcers of limitations on human perception and understanding. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, consider the possibility that the greatest mysteries aren't found in distant stars, but in the shadows between what we experience and what we're allowed to remember experiencing. The sophistication of these operations becomes even more apparent when we examine the encounter experienced by seismologist Dr. Elena Vasquez while monitoring earthquake activity in Northern California during August 2018. Dr. Vasquez had been tracking unusual seismic patterns that seemed to originate from deep underground sources that didn't correspond to any known geological formations or tectonic activity. The monitoring station where Dr. Vasquez worked was positioned near the San Andreas Fault, equipped with sensitive instruments capable of detecting the slightest ground movements from hundreds of miles away. For weeks, her equipment had been recording rhythmic vibrations that followed mathematical patterns rather than the chaotic signatures typical of natural geological processes. The tremors occurred at precise intervals, suggesting artificial origin rather than tectonic activity. What made the readings particularly intriguing was their apparent correlation with atmospheric disturbances detected by weather monitoring stations across the region. Each underground pulse was followed by corresponding electromagnetic anomalies in the upper atmosphere, creating a pattern that suggested some kind of coordinated activity between surface and subterranean sources. Dr. Vasquez had been documenting these anomalies for 3 weeks, preparing a comprehensive analysis that would challenge conventional understanding of geological processes. Her data suggested the presence of artificial systems operating deep beneath the Earth's surface, systems capable of generating precisely controlled seismic activity that somehow interfaced with atmospheric phenomena. The technical failures began during her night shift on August 15th. Dr. Vasquez was alone at the monitoring station when every piece of seismographic equipment simultaneously experienced what appeared to be coordinated system crashes. Instruments that had operated flawlessly for years suddenly displayed error messages, corrupted data streams, and complete memory wipes that erased weeks of accumulated readings. The failures were so comprehensive and synchronized that they couldn't have been coincidental. Someone with intimate knowledge of seismographic systems had apparently initiated remote shutdown procedures that bypassed every security protocol Dr. Vasquez had implemented. The attack demonstrated technological capabilities that exceeded what most civilian institutions possessed. By morning, the monitoring station appeared to be functioning normally, but all historical data related to the anomalous readings had been permanently erased. Backup systems that should have preserved the information had also been compromised, leaving no trace of the extraordinary patterns Dr. Vasquez had been documenting. The systematic data destruction was so thorough that it seemed designed to make her question whether the anomalies had ever existed. The visitors arrived while Dr. Vasquez was still attempting to understand how her security systems had been so completely compromised. A man and woman appeared at the monitoring station, both wearing professional attire that suggested government employment without clearly identifying specific agencies. They introduced themselves as technical specialists investigating electromagnetic interference with geological monitoring equipment. The visitors demonstrated detailed knowledge of Dr. Vasquez's work, referencing specific data points and analytical methods that should have been known only to her immediate research team. They knew about the seismic anomalies she'd been tracking, the atmospheric correlations she'd discovered, even the precise timing of the equipment failures she'd experienced. Their explanation was technical and sophisticated, involving classified underground testing of deep Earth-penetrating radar systems that could create artificial seismic signatures while monitoring geological stability. The rhythmic vibrations Dr. Vasquez had detected were actually controlled experiments in subsurface imaging, highly classified research that required protection from foreign geological survey services who might exploit seismic data for strategic resource identification. The equipment failures were explained as necessary security measures to prevent classified seismic signatures from being inadvertently recorded by civilian monitoring stations. Dr. Vasquez's systems had been remotely disabled not maliciously, but as part of routine protocols designed to protect sensitive military geology research from accidental disclosure through academic channels. The visitors provided Dr. Vasquez with upgraded monitoring equipment that included enhanced capabilities for detecting natural seismic activity while filtering out artificial signals that might interfere with legitimate geological research. The new systems represented significant technological improvements, offering analytical capabilities that could advance her career while ensuring that classified signals remained undetected. Dr. Vasquez found herself confronting a familiar dilemma, torn between scientific curiosity and professional pragmatism. The equipment upgrades offered genuine advantages for her research, but accepting them meant acknowledging that her previous observations had been misinterpretations of classified military activities rather than discoveries of unknown geological phenomena. The psychological pressure was expertly calibrated, appealing to Dr. Vasquez's professional ambitions, while making resistance seem both futile and potentially harmful to national security interests. The visitors never explicitly threatened her career, but they made it clear that uncooperative researchers might find their access to monitoring sites restricted and their funding applications subjected to additional security reviews. Dr. Vasquez accepted the equipment upgrades and signed agreements acknowledging her understanding of electromagnetic interference protocols related to classified geological research. She convinced herself that the seismic anomalies she'd observed were probably explained by the deep Earth radar testing, nothing more mysterious than advanced subsurface imaging technologies being evaluated under strict security classification. The incident was officially recorded as equipment malfunction due to electromagnetic interference, with no mention of the extraordinary seismic patterns that had preceded the technical problems. Dr. Vasquez's research continued using the new monitoring systems, but she never again detected the kind of rhythmic underground activity that had characterized her observations before the visit. Her experience illustrates how the Men in Black phenomenon has expanded to encompass geological and atmospheric sciences, suggesting that the reality management system operates across multiple scientific disciplines. The provision of upgraded equipment creates dependencies that ensure long-term compliance while providing plausible explanations for the suppression of inconvenient discoveries. This scientific infiltration becomes even more apparent when we examine the encounter experienced by marine archaeologist Dr. Robert Chen while investigating underwater anomalies off the coast of Southern California during October 2019. Dr. Chen was leading a team using advanced sonar mapping technology to explore previously uncharted sections of the continental shelf, searching for evidence of ancient human settlements that might have been submerged by rising sea levels. The underwater surveys had revealed structures that challenged conventional understanding of both ancient human capabilities and natural geological processes. The sonar images showed what appeared to be artificial constructions at depths that should have been above sea level only during Ice Age periods, when advanced human civilizations weren't supposed to have existed in North America. Most intriguingly, the structures displayed architectural features that suggested technological sophistication far beyond what mainstream archaeology attributed to ancient peoples. The constructions showed evidence of precise geometric planning, advanced engineering techniques, and materials that shouldn't have been available to prehistoric civilizations. Dr. Chen's team had been preparing to conduct detailed underwater excavations when their research vessel was approached by a Coast Guard cutter requesting permission to board for what was described as a routine inspection of archaeological permits and diving equipment. The timing seemed coincidental, but the boarding party included individuals who clearly weren't standard Coast Guard personnel. The lead investigator introduced himself as Commander Walsh, though his credentials bore classifications that Dr. Chen didn't recognize from standard military or civilian agencies. Commander Walsh demonstrated detailed knowledge of the underwater surveys, referencing specific sonar readings and structural features that should have been known only to the immediate research team. The explanation Commander Walsh provided involved classified submarine testing in the area, with underwater structures that civilian archaeologists might mistake for ancient ruins, actually representing experimental naval installations designed to evaluate new materials and construction techniques in marine environments. The structures Dr. Chen had discovered were classified military assets that required protection from foreign intelligence services who might exploit archaeological research to gather information about American underwater capabilities. The boarding party requested that Dr. Chen surrender all sonar data and underwater imagery related to the structures, explaining that national security concerns required temporary confiscation of materials that might inadvertently compromise classified naval research. The archaeological team could continue their work in other areas, but the specific sites they'd been investigating were now designated as restricted naval testing zones. Dr. Chen protested that his team's research was purely academic, focused on ancient human civilizations rather than modern military installations. Commander Walsh acknowledged the legitimate scientific value of the work, but explained that the structures in question were definitely artificial, just not as ancient as Dr. Chen assumed. The psychological approach was particularly sophisticated, appealing to Dr. Chen's patriotic instincts while reframing his discoveries as potential national security vulnerabilities rather than archaeological treasures. The visitors suggested that responsible researchers understood the importance of protecting American technological advantages, even when that protection required temporary restrictions on academic freedom. Dr. Chen found himself positioned as someone whose work might inadvertently assist foreign intelligence gathering, despite his genuine commitment to advancing human knowledge of ancient civilizations. The visitors never questioned his motives or competence, instead appealing to his desire to conduct research that strengthened rather than compromised American interests. The equipment and data were transferred to the Coast Guard vessel, with promises that materials would be returned once security reviews were completed. Dr. Chen received alternative research funding for projects focusing on terrestrial archaeological sites that wouldn't risk interference with classified naval activities. The underwater structures were permanently designated as restricted military zones, effectively ending any possibility of academic investigation. Dr. Chen continued his career using the alternative funding, conducting research on conventional archaeological subjects that avoided potentially sensitive discoveries. He published papers on traditional topics, received recognition for his cooperation with national security requirements, and gradually accepted that the underwater structures had probably been misidentified military installations rather than ancient ruins. His experience reveals the military security angle, often employed in Men in Black operations, the way legitimate defense concerns can be used to suppress archaeological discoveries that might challenge established historical narratives. The visitors didn't need to deny that extraordinary structures existed. They simply reclassified them as modern military assets rather than ancient mysteries. This military reframing represents another layer of the sophisticated psychological manipulation employed by these mysterious visitors. By appealing to patriotic duty and national security concerns, they transform scientific suppression into civic responsibility, making resistance seem not just futile, but potentially treasonous. The evolution of these operations continues with the encounter experienced by atmospheric physicist Dr. Sarah Kim, while conducting research on unusual electromagnetic phenomena in the mountains of Montana during June 2020. Dr. Kim was investigating reports of localized electromagnetic anomalies that seemed to interfere with both natural atmospheric processes and artificial communication systems in ways that challenged conventional understanding of electromagnetic field behavior. Her research had detected electromagnetic signatures that appeared to be artificially generated, creating field patterns that couldn't be explained by natural atmospheric phenomena or known human technology. The signals demonstrated characteristics that suggested the presence of advanced electromagnetic manipulation systems operating from unknown sources. Most remarkably, the electromagnetic anomalies seemed to correlate with unusual atmospheric optical effects, creating visible distortions in the air that resembled heat mirages, but occurred under temperature conditions that shouldn't have supported such phenomena. The correlation between electromagnetic readings and visual effects suggested that someone was actively experimenting with atmospheric manipulation technologies. Dr. Kim had been documenting these phenomena for several months when her research station experienced what appeared to be a coordinated cyber attack that targeted her electromagnetic monitoring equipment while leaving other systems completely unaffected. The attack demonstrated intimate knowledge of her specific research focus and the technical specifications of her monitoring instruments. The visitors arrived during the aftermath of the cyber attack, while Dr. Kim was still attempting to restore her compromised systems. Two individuals appeared at her research station, both wearing civilian clothes that suggested government employment without clearly identifying specific agencies. They introduced themselves as technical consultants investigating electromagnetic interference with atmospheric research equipment. The visitors demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of Dr. Kim's work, referencing specific electromagnetic readings and atmospheric observations that should have been known only to her. They knew about the cyber attack she'd experienced, the equipment failures that had resulted, even the specific data that had been corrupted or destroyed. Their explanation involved classified atmospheric research being conducted by military contractors, creating electromagnetic effects that could interfere with civilian monitoring equipment while testing advanced weather modification technologies. The phenomena Dr. Kim had observed were actually controlled experiments in atmospheric manipulation, highly classified research that required protection from foreign meteorological services who might exploit electromagnetic signatures for strategic weather prediction advantages. The cyber attack was explained as a necessary security measure to prevent classified electromagnetic signatures from being inadvertently recorded by civilian researchers. Kim's systems had been targeted not maliciously, but as part of routine protocols designed to protect sensitive atmospheric research from accidental disclosure through academic channels. The visitors offered Dr. Kim replacement equipment that included advanced electromagnetic monitoring capabilities while incorporating security features that would automatically filter out classified signals that might interfere with legitimate atmospheric research. The new systems represented significant technological upgrades that could revolutionize her work while ensuring that sensitive military research remained protected. Dr. Kim accepted the replacement equipment and signed agreements acknowledging her understanding of electromagnetic interference protocols related to classified atmospheric research. She convinced herself that the phenomena she'd observed were probably explained by the weather modification testing, nothing more extraordinary than advanced atmospheric manipulation technologies being evaluated under strict security classification. The incident was officially recorded as equipment failure due to cybersecurity vulnerabilities, with no mention of the extraordinary electromagnetic phenomena that had preceded the technical problems. Dr. Kim's research continued using the new monitoring systems, but she never again detected the kind of anomalous electromagnetic activity that had characterized her observations before the visit. Her experience illustrates how the Men in Black phenomenon has adapted to cyber warfare capabilities, using sophisticated digital attacks to destroy evidence while providing plausible technical explanations for the destruction. The integration of cyber operations with psychological manipulation creates multiple layers of plausible deniability that make resistance seem not just futile, but technically naive. The technological sophistication becomes even more apparent when we examine the encounter experienced by computer scientist Dr. Michael Torres while investigating anomalous data patterns in global communication networks during September 2020. Dr. Torres was analyzing unusual signal propagation patterns that seemed to suggest the existence of communication networks operating outside normal internet infrastructure. His research had detected data streams that followed routing patterns inconsistent with known internet architecture, suggesting the presence of parallel communication systems that operated independently of conventional networks. The signals demonstrated encryption techniques that exceeded publicly available cryptographic capabilities, indicating access to advanced security technologies that shouldn't have existed in civilian networks. Most intriguingly, the anomalous data streams seem to correlate with reported sightings of unexplained phenomena across multiple geographic regions, creating communication patterns that suggested coordinated monitoring and response activities on a global scale. The correlation between data anomalies and unusual events implied the existence of comprehensive surveillance and communication networks operating beyond public awareness. Dr. Torres had been preparing to publish his analysis when his research systems experienced sophisticated cyber attacks that targeted his specific data analysis tools while leaving other software completely unaffected. The attacks demonstrated intimate knowledge of his research methods and the particular vulnerabilities of his analytical software. The visitors arrived while Dr. Torres was still dealing with the cybersecurity breaches, appearing at his university office during evening hours when the building should have been secured. Two individuals gained access without triggering security systems, both wearing professional attire that suggested government employment, without clearly identifying specific agencies. The visitors demonstrated detailed knowledge of Dr. Torres's research, referencing specific data patterns and analytical methods that should have been known only to him. They knew about the cyber attacks he'd experienced, the vulnerabilities that had been exploited, even the specific analytical techniques he'd been using to trace the anomalous communication networks. Their explanation involved classified communication security research being conducted by intelligence agencies, creating data patterns that civilian researchers might mistake for unknown networks, but actually represented experimental security protocols designed to protect sensitive government communications from foreign cyber warfare capabilities. The cyber attacks were explained as necessary security measures to prevent classified communication protocols from being inadvertently analyzed by civilian researchers. Dr. Torres's systems had been targeted not maliciously, but as part of routine protocols designed to protect sensitive communication security research from accidental disclosure through academic analysis. The visitors offered Dr. Torres access to advanced analytical tools and classified research opportunities that would allow him to contribute to legitimate cybersecurity research while ensuring that sensitive communication protocols remained protected from foreign intelligence services. The opportunities represented significant career advancement that few computer scientists could afford to refuse. Dr. Torres accepted the research opportunities and signed agreements acknowledging his understanding of communication security protocols related to classified network research. He convinced himself that the data anomalies he'd detected were probably explained by the experimental security systems, nothing more mysterious than advanced communication protection technologies being evaluated under strict classification. His research focus shifted to conventional cybersecurity topics that avoided potentially sensitive discoveries about unknown communication networks. He published papers on traditional subjects, received recognition for his cooperation with national security requirements, and gradually forgot about the anomalous data patterns that had suggested the existence of parallel communication systems. Dr. Torres's experience reveals how the Men in Black phenomenon has extended into cybersecurity and information warfare, using sophisticated digital capabilities to monitor and manipulate academic research while providing career incentives that ensure long-term compliance. The integration of cyber operations with professional advancement creates dependencies that make resistance seem not just technically impossible, but economically irrational. These encounters demonstrate how the Men in Black phenomenon has evolved into a comprehensive system of reality management that operates across multiple disciplines, using advanced technologies and psychological manipulation to ensure that extraordinary discoveries are systematically suppressed or reframed as conventional phenomena. The witnesses aren't random individuals. They're professionals whose expertise and access to advanced equipment made them capable of documenting evidence that someone desperately wants to keep hidden. The consistency of these operations across different time periods, geographic locations, and professional disciplines suggests coordination at levels that transcend individual government agencies or departments. The technological capabilities demonstrated in these encounters often exceed what most institutions publicly acknowledge possessing, indicating access to resources and capabilities that operate beyond normal bureaucratic oversight. Most disturbing of all, these encounters reveal how easily extraordinary experiences can be transformed into ordinary explanations through a combination of technological manipulation, bureaucratic authority, and psychological pressure so sophisticated that victims rarely recognize they're being controlled. The Men in Black don't operate outside legitimate institutions. They've apparently infiltrated and co-opted those institutions, creating a shadow system that mirrors official processes while serving entirely different purposes. As you drift deeper into sleep tonight, consider the implications of these accounts for our understanding of reality in modern society. If scientists can be monitored, their research can be manipulated, and their discoveries can be suppressed through processes that appear legitimate and voluntary, what does that suggest about the nature of knowledge and truth in our carefully managed world? The Men in Black represent more than mysterious visitors. They embody a system of control so subtle and sophisticated that most people never realize they've encountered it. They are the quiet guardians of consensus reality, ensuring that certain truths remain hidden and certain questions remain unasked. In our age of information and surveillance, they remind us that the greatest mysteries aren't found in distant galaxies, but in the shadows between what we experience and what we're allowed to believe we've experienced. Tonight, as these stories fade into the peaceful realm of sleep, let them serve as gentle reminders that our world may be far stranger and more carefully orchestrated than we're encouraged to believe. The Men in Black walk among us, not as visitors from other worlds, but as agents of this one, quietly managing the boundaries between the possible and the officially acknowledged possible. Sweet dreams. And remember that sometimes the most profound truths are found not in what we're told to see, but in what we're quietly discouraged from noticing. The shadows hold their secrets well, and the Men in Black are their faithful guardians, ensuring that some mysteries remain forever just beyond the edge of acceptable reality. These accounts paint a picture of a world where the boundaries between reality and managed perception have become so blurred that most people can no longer distinguish between authentic experience and carefully constructed alternative explanations. The Men in Black operate within this grey area, not by denying that extraordinary events occur, but by providing frameworks that allow witnesses to maintain their sanity while abandoning their inconvenient truths. What makes these encounters particularly unsettling is their cumulative effect on our collective understanding of what's possible in modern America. Each individual case might be dismissed as coincidence, misperception, or the unfortunate intersection of classified activities with civilian curiosity. But taken together, these stories reveal patterns that suggest something far more systematic and comprehensive than random bureaucratic encounters. The witnesses you've heard about tonight represent a small fraction of those who've experienced similar encounters. For every person willing to share their story, researchers estimate that dozens more remain silent, either because they've convinced themselves that nothing extraordinary occurred, or because they understand intuitively that speaking publicly would bring more unwanted attention from authorities who prefer to operate in shadows. This silence serves the system perfectly, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where extraordinary experiences are systematically isolated and neutralized before they can contribute to broader public awareness. Witnesses become complicit in their own silencing, not through fear or intimidation, but through sophisticated psychological processes that make compliance seem like the rational, responsible choice. The technological capabilities demonstrated in these encounters often exceed what most government agencies publicly acknowledge possessing, suggesting access to resources that operate beyond normal oversight and accountability. The ability to manipulate digital evidence, interfere with electronic systems, and apparently influence human memory itself implies research and development programs that exist in the deepest shadows of classified projects. More troubling still is the apparent integration of these operations into legitimate institutional processes. The men in black don't operate as rogue agents working outside the system. They appear to function as part of a shadow bureaucracy that mirrors official agencies while serving different masters and different purposes. Their credentials seem authentic, their knowledge of regulations appears comprehensive, and their authority feels genuine, even when their requests clearly violate standard protocols. This institutional camouflage makes the phenomenon particularly difficult to investigate or expose. Witnesses can't easily dismiss visitors who arrive with proper identification and demonstrate legitimate knowledge of official procedures. The encounters feel authentically governmental even when their substance suggests something far more mysterious than routine bureaucratic business. The psychological sophistication of these operations represents perhaps their most remarkable characteristic. The visitors seem to understand human nature with clinical precision, knowing exactly how to apply pressure without creating resistance, how to offer alternatives that preserve dignity while achieving compliance, and how to make extraordinary experiences seem ordinary through the simple provision of rational explanations. They understand that most people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, that professional survival often outweighs personal integrity, and that the desire to maintain one's reputation and livelihood can override the commitment to preserving inconvenient memories. By appealing to these basic human motivations, they transform potential whistleblowers into willing participants in their own psychological manipulation. The witnesses in tonight's stories weren't seeking fame or attention. They were ordinary people who happened to observe extraordinary events and found themselves caught in webs of explanation and alternative narrative that made resistance seem not just futile, but irrational. They were offered ways to maintain their dignity while abandoning their truth, provided with career advancement in exchange for silence, and given rational frameworks that allowed them to preserve their sanity while surrendering their authentic experiences. This process of reality management operates so smoothly that most victims never recognize they've been manipulated. They genuinely believe they've made rational decisions based on reasonable explanations provided by legitimate authorities. The system works precisely because it offers people what they want: logical answers to illogical experiences, professional advancement in exchange for discretion, and membership in the comfortable majority rather than the uncomfortable minority of those who've seen too much. The implications extend far beyond individual cases of witness management. If ordinary citizens can observe extraordinary events and then receive visits from mysterious officials who somehow possess intimate knowledge of private experiences, what does that suggest about the level of surveillance and monitoring operating just beyond public awareness? How many aspects of our daily lives are observed, recorded, and potentially subject to intervention by authorities we never see and agencies we can't identify? These questions become even more troubling when we consider the technological capabilities apparently available to these mysterious visitors. The ability to corrupt digital evidence in real time, manipulate satellite imagery, interfere with electronic systems, and possibly influence human memory suggests access to technologies that most people assume exist only in science fiction. Yet the consistency of these accounts across different time periods and geographic locations implies that such capabilities are not only real, but routinely deployed. The Men in Black phenomenon represents more than a collection of strange encounters. It embodies a comprehensive system of information control that operates across multiple sectors of society. From military personnel to civilian witnesses, from academic researchers to media professionals, the pattern suggests a coordinated effort to manage public perception of extraordinary phenomena through a combination of technological capability and psychological manipulation. This system doesn't suppress information through crude censorship or obvious intimidation. Instead, it operates through subtle influence, providing alternative explanations that allow people to maintain their self-respect while abandoning inconvenient truths. It appeals to professional ambitions, patriotic instincts, environmental consciousness, and social responsibility, transforming potential resistance into willing cooperation. The effectiveness of this approach cannot be overstated. Traditional forms of censorship create martyrs and generate sympathy for suppressed information. But a system that provides rational alternatives to irrational experiences, that offers career advancement in exchange for discretion, and that appeals to people's better instincts while achieving the same suppression of information, faces no organized resistance because its victims don't recognize themselves as victims. They see themselves as rational people who've accepted reasonable explanations for confusing experiences, as professionals who've made sensible career decisions, as responsible citizens who understand the importance of protecting national security or environmental resources or indigenous cultural heritage. The system succeeds because it allows people to feel good about their compliance while achieving the same results as the most brutal forms of information suppression. This psychological sophistication suggests that the Men in Black phenomenon represents the evolution of control systems to match the complexity of modern society. In earlier eras, authorities could suppress information through simple censorship or physical intimidation. But in an age of digital communication, academic freedom, and widespread literacy, more subtle approaches became necessary. The Men in Black embody this evolution, representing a form of soft control that achieves hard results through psychological rather than physical means. They don't need to threaten because they've created systems where compliance appears to be the only rational choice. They don't need to censor because they've developed methods that make people censor themselves. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through these shadowy encounters, consider what these stories suggest about the nature of reality in contemporary America. The witnesses you've heard about aren't conspiracy theorists or attention seekers. They're ordinary people who experience extraordinary events and discovered that the boundaries between official reality and actual experience are far more malleable than most of us realize. Their encounters reveal a world where digital evidence can be seamlessly corrupted, where satellite imagery can be manipulated in real time, where human memory can apparently be influenced through unknown means, and where the very foundations of proof and documentation become questionable when they conflict with officially preferred narratives. Most troubling of all, these stories suggest that we live in a society where the most sophisticated forms of control operate not through force or obvious censorship, but through the provision of comfortable alternatives to uncomfortable truths. The Men in Black succeed because they offer people what they want: rational explanations for irrational experiences, professional advancement in exchange for silence, and membership in consensus reality rather than the isolated realm of those who've witnessed the impossible. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let these accounts serve as gentle reminders that our world may be far stranger and more carefully managed than we're encouraged to believe. The Men in Black walk among us, not as visitors from distant worlds, but as agents of this one, quietly ensuring that certain truths remain hidden and certain questions remain unasked. They are the invisible architects of consensus reality, the silent guardians of officially sanctioned possibility. The quiet enforcers of boundaries between what we experience and what we're allowed to believe we've experienced. In our age of information and surveillance, they remind us that the greatest form of control isn't the suppression of truth, but the provision of alternatives that make truth irrelevant. Sweet dreams, dear listeners. And remember that sometimes the most profound mysteries aren't found in distant galaxies or alien worlds, but in the quiet spaces between what happens and what we're told has happened, between what we witness and what we're encouraged to remember witnessing, between the reality we experience and the reality we're invited to accept. The men in black will continue their quiet work, visiting witnesses, providing explanations, offering alternatives, and ensuring that the extraordinary remains safely contained within the boundaries of the officially explainable. They are the human face of systems operating far beyond public awareness, the visible representatives of invisible authorities, the gentle shepherds guiding us away from truths that someone has decided we're not ready to handle. In the morning, these stories will fade into the comfortable realm of entertainment, but their implications will linger in the deeper corners of your consciousness, quiet reminders that our carefully ordered world may be far more mysterious and far more managed than we dare to acknowledge. The shadows hold their secrets well, and the men in black are their faithful guardians, ensuring that some mysteries remain forever just beyond the edge of acceptable reality. Rest well and dream peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, quiet figures in dark suits continue their endless vigil, protecting us from truths we might not be ready to face, managing realities we might not be prepared to accept, and ensuring that the boundaries between the possible and the officially possible remain exactly where they've been carefully placed. Until we meet again in the realm of the unexplained, good night.